So let me be very clear about something foundational. Human beings are biologically wired for attachment. We are creatures that crave connection, not because it's convenient, but because our survival has always depended on it. But within that fundamental truth, there's an uncomfortable tension. Not all of us are wired the same way when it comes to closeness. And one of the most difficult types to love or even understand is the avoidant. Avoidant individuals often carry an invisible but deeply entrenched fear, the fear of emotional dependency. This isn't always something they can articulate, nor are they always consciously aware of it. It's wired into the nervous system, often shaped by early childhood experiences where emotional closeness was either inconsistent, intrusive, or unavailable. What this creates is an internal narrative that closeness equals danger, that vulnerability leads to engulfment or betrayal, and that to need someone is to lose oneself. At the core of this fear is a profound mistrust, both of others and of the self in relation to others. Dependency, in their minds, isn't an act of mutual support. It's a slippery slope toward being controlled, consumed, or emotionally trapped. They've learned, often from a very young age, that to rely on others is to risk disappointment, abandonment, or shame. So instead, they learn to rely on themselves, to be hyper-dependent, self-contained, and emotionally distant. These are not merely preferences. These are defense mechanisms built to survive a world where connection once felt unsafe. Now, what makes this dynamic particularly confusing for their partners is that avoidants often do desire intimacy. They want love, connection, and even commitment, but they fear what it might cost them. The closer you get to an avoidant, the more they instinctively retreat. The very emotional presence that a securely attached person would experience as warmth or safety, the avoidant perceives as pressure or threat, and because they fear dependency, they misinterpret healthy emotional needs as demands and closeness as a loss of control. This fear manifests in countless subtle ways. An avoidant might pull away after a meaningful date, ghost after a vulnerable conversation, or become irritable when asked to share feelings. They might prioritize work, hobbies, or even vague notions of freedom over intimacy. Not because they don't care, but because caring too much feels dangerous. In their world, attachment equals vulnerability. Why? And vulnerability is something they were never taught how to handle. It's important to understand that this isn't about ego or cruelty. This is a deeply ingrained survival strategy. The avoidance fear of dependency isn't a rational choice, it's an emotional reflex. Their body remembers what their mind may have long suppressed, that love comes with a cost. And that cost, in their experience, has always been too high. What makes this even more tragic is that avoidants often long for the very connection they resist, but the fear hijacks their nervous system before they can act on that longing. As soon as someone becomes too emotionally important, the avoidance system kicks in with distance, withdrawal, or even emotional shutdown. They begin to devalue the other person, not because they stop caring, but because caring too much feels like danger. This is why emotional availability, when given too freely to an avoidant, often backfires. It triggers the exact fear they're trying to avoid. Understanding this fear doesn't mean excusing unhealthy behavior, but it does mean recognizing the psychological depth behind it. Avoidants fear dependency not because they don't want love, but because they were never shown how to feel safe within it. When you're constantly emotionally available to someone with an avoidant attachment style, you unintentionally create a dynamic that overwhelms rather than soothes. Emotional overexposure occurs when your consistent presence, your texts, reassurances, affection, and efforts becomes too much for the avoidant to handle. This isn't because your love is wrong or excessive in any moral sense. It's because the avoidant nervous system interprets emotional intensity as intrusion rather than intimacy. Avoidant individuals often grew up in environments where emotions were either ignored, invalidated, or outright punished. As a result, They learn to suppress their feelings, rely only on themselves, and maintain emotional distance as a form of safety. When someone comes along and offers open emotional presence, it disrupts their inner balance. To them, what feels like care to you feels like pressure to them. Your emotional availability begins to register as an expectation, a demand, or a burden. The more they sense your emotional presence, the more they feel a need to protect themselves from perceived engulfment. This is where the equation begins to invert. What is healthy in secure attachment becomes threatening in avoidant dynamics. Constant check-ins, ongoing expressions of love or efforts to connect may be misread as control or clinginess. Over time, the avoidant begins to feel suffocated not by anything aggressive you've done, but by the sheer consistency of your emotional accessibility. It violates the distance they subconsciously need to feel in control of themselves. This is why avoidants often respond with silence, withdrawal, or even criticism when their partner becomes too emotionally present. It's not always a conscious choice. They're not trying to hurt you. They're trying to regulate themselves. But the tragedy is that their regulation strategy creates disconnection. And for the partner, this feels like rejection. Because on some level, it is. Emotional overexposure also removes the space avoidants need to experience their own feelings. When you're always emotionally present, you unintentionally prevent them from recognizing their own longing. They don't have the opportunity to miss you, to reflect, or to recalibrate their emotional defenses. Instead, they remain in a reactive state, focused not on their feelings for you, but on how to protect themselves from your emotional presence. Ironically, it's often in your absence, when you step back and stop overgiving, that the avoidant begins to process what they truly feel. Emotional distance creates emotional contrast. It allows the avoidant to experience the emptiness without your constant filling of that space. And only then, sometimes painfully and slowly, do they begin to recognize what your presence actually meant. Constant emotional availability is not a flaw. It's a beautiful thing when offered in the right relational context. But when paired with an avoidant, it becomes too much too soon. Emotional overexposure triggers the avoidant's defense mechanisms, not because you're too much, but because they haven't yet learned how to handle closeness without fear. Understanding this allows you to shift the dynamic, not by withholding love, but by offering it more wisely with boundaries that honor both your needs and their limits. Holding emotional availability from an avoidant partner often feels counterintuitive, especially if you're someone who believes that love means showing up no matter what. But in the context of avoidant attachment, stepping back is not cruelty, it's clarity. It's the act of ceasing to fill the emotional space so completely that the other person never has to face themselves. When you stop being constantly available, you interrupt their pattern of emotional avoidance and give them the one thing their system resists the most: space for self-reflection. Avoidant individuals are skilled at keeping their focus outward. They stay busy, distracted, and emotionally disengaged because this allows them to avoid confronting their inner world. Their internal narrative is often built around a deep discomfort with vulnerability, an ingrained belief that needing others is dangerous or weak. When someone is always present, always reaching out, always emotionally available, the avoidant never has to examine these beliefs. They can stay emotionally disengaged while still receiving the benefits of your connection. But when you withdraw, when you stop over-partnering in the relationship, something powerful happens. The avoidant is left alone with their thoughts, without the buffer of your emotional labor. They can no longer blame your intensity or your needs for their discomfort. Instead, they are confronted with silence, with space, and eventually with the reality of their own internal disconnection. This is where self-reflection begins, not because you told them to reflect, but because the absence of your availability creates a vacuum that demands internal attention. For the first time, they may start to ask themselves difficult questions. Why do I feel relief when someone steps back and yet also a strange sense of loss? Why do I crave independence so strongly but feel lonely when I get it? What am I really afraid of? Of course, this self-reflection doesn't always happen immediately. Avoidants are masters of distraction. They may initially rationalize your distance as confirmation that people always leave or that emotional closeness is too risky, but over time, the consistent absence of your emotional input forces them to reckon with their own defenses. They can no longer use your emotional availability as an excuse to shut down or retreat. The mirror you used to hold up for them is gone, and now they must face their own reflection. This space is essential. Without it, growth is nearly impossible. Constant emotional availability gives the avoidant a way to maintain the status quo. Your presence keeps their emotional ecosystem artificially balanced. But when you step away, even subtly, you allow natural emotional consequences to arise. They begin to feel the effects of their own behavior. They experience the emotional cost of avoidance, not theoretically, but viscerally, withholding. Availability is not about punishment, it's about allowing the emotional system to reset. It's about creating the conditions where real insight can emerge, not through confrontation, but through silence. And often, it's only in that silence that the avoidant begins to see what they were so desperate not to feel: the need for connection, the fear of loss, and the pain of pushing love away. Human psychology is deeply influenced by the principle of scarcity. We tend to assign greater value to things that are limited, unavailable, or difficult to obtain. This isn't a flaw, it's a survival instinct. Scarcity signals importance. It tells the brain, this might not always be here, pay attention. When it comes to relationships, this principle applies just as powerfully, especially in the case of avoidant attachment. When you are always emotionally available to someone with an avoidant style, your presence becomes expected, even taken for granted. But when you step back, when your emotional availability becomes scarce, it activates an entirely different response: value recognition. Avoidants often struggle with emotional inconsistency. They simultaneously crave connection and fear it. They want intimacy, but when it arrives, it feels threatening, so they push it away. And if you keep showing up despite this pushing, your presence begins to lose psychological weight. It becomes predictable. And predictability in the mind of an avoidant doesn't feel like safety. It feels like pressure. They don't have to assess your value because they assume you're always going to be there. But once you become scarce, once your emotional presence is no longer a given, everything changes. Your absence begins to speak louder than your words ever could. Suddenly, the avoidant can't rely on your texts, your reassurances, your efforts to hold the connection together. And this space, this emotional silence, creates an environment where your value is no longer assumed. It must be considered. It must be felt. This is not manipulation, it's reality. When something is rare, the brain starts to question, was that thing more important than I realized? That questioning is the beginning of emotional awakening. For the avoidant, your absence creates a gap in their world, a gap they didn't feel when you were always present. And into that gap comes memory, reflection, and eventually desire. What's critical to understand is that value cannot be explained to someone who is unwilling to see it. You can't argue for your worth. You can't convince someone to appreciate you by offering more of yourself. In fact, the more you offer, the less they feel the need to evaluate what you mean to them. It's only when the emotional supply is cut off that the avoidant is forced to face what they've been avoiding, not just you, but the feelings associated with you. Scarcity creates the condition where true value is revealed not through persuasion, but through absence. This doesn't mean you withhold yourself to gain power or manipulate. It means you recognize your own worth enough to stop overgiving. You allow emotional self-possession. It's the decision to no longer allow someone else's ambivalence to define your worth or dictate your behavior. It's the refusal to participate in a dynamic that leaves you depleted, uncertain, and emotionally small. Being perpetually available to someone who doesn't reciprocate creates a subtle but corrosive imbalance. You begin adjusting your behavior to avoid triggering their distance. You censor your needs, shrink your emotional expression, and prioritize their comfort over your truth. Over time, this pattern erodes your sense of identity. You begin to believe that your love is only acceptable if it's convenient, your affection only valuable if it doesn't come with expectation. You abandon parts of yourself in hopes that they'll finally let you in. And in doing so, you give away your power. But when you stop, when you pause the chase, go quiet, or simply redirect your emotional energy inward, you disrupt the cycle. You send a message not only to them, but to yourself. I matter too. You stop trying to extract validation from someone who is emotionally walled off, and you begin offering it to yourself. This shift is transformational because it recenters the locus of control back where it belongs, within you. Reclaiming your power doesn't mean shutting down or becoming cold. It means creating emotional boundaries that honor your dignity. It's recognizing that love cannot be sustained by one-sided effort. It's understanding that healthy relationships require reciprocity, not perfection, but participation. When you step back, you're no longer reacting to their hot and cold behavior. You're choosing peace over chaos. You're choosing self-respect over emotional breadcrumbs. This act of reclaiming power often creates a paradoxical effect. The very distance that protectively shields the avoidant begins to collapse under its own weight. When you're no longer holding up the other side, they may start to question their own reactions, reflect on their behavior, or even reach back out. But whether they do or don't is no longer the point, because the most important shift has already occurred within you. You stop waiting for someone else to wake up to your value. You stop begging love to stay. You begin living from a place of emotional integrity, where your sense of self is no longer tied to someone else's capacity. To those who long deeply for intimacy and who associate distance with rejection or abandonment. But in relationships where avoidant attachment is present, closeness can trigger defensiveness, fear, and withdrawal. It can overwhelm rather than soothe. Ironically, it is often only when you step back, when you stop reaching out, stop over-explaining, stop proving your love, that the seeds of genuine connection are finally given space to grow. When someone with an avoidant attachment style feels overwhelmed by emotional closeness, they often respond by creating space, consciously or unconsciously. They pull away, go quiet, or minimize the importance of the relationship, not because they don't care, but because their nervous system is wired to perceive emotional intensity as a threat. They need space, not because they want to hurt you, but because it's the only way they know to feel safe. But when that space is not honored, when it's filled with more effort, more chasing, more emotional availability, the avoidant feels smothered and confirms their worst fear, that intimacy leads to the loss of self. This is why absence can become a powerful catalyst. When you stop filling the emotional air, you allow the avoidant to breathe. More importantly, you allow them to feel. For the first time, they are alone with their own reactions, not yours. They are no longer preoccupied with managing your expectations, dodging your vulnerability, or controlling your perception of them. Instead, they are left with their own silence, and within that silence, their truth begins to emerge. Absence interrupts the cycle of reactivity. It introduces a pause where reflection can begin. And in that pause, something unexpected can happen. The avoidant begins to recognize what they miss, not just your presence, but your essence, the stability, the care, the warmth they once pushed away. They begin to feel the contrast between what life feels like with you and what life feels like without you. This emotional contrast is crucial because it shifts connection from something they're defending against to something they're choosing to move toward. Real connection requires agency. It cannot be forced, begged for, or demanded. It must come from within, and that is what absence allows. The opportunity for the avoidant to choose, not out of guilt, not out of fear of losing you, but out of clarity. They must sit with the reality of distance long enough to understand what it means. Only then can true connection be born, not as a reaction to pressure, but as a movement from authenticity.